Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'm going to do kind of a combination of reading a little bit from the book and mostly just talking from slides. And I'll probably take this sweater off and put it on 6 or 7 times throughout the talk, as I can't decide whether I'm hot or cold. So, and I'm gonna, I thought I would start with this image, which is from underneath the stairs at the archive that houses the papers of the Comintern. And as I said, yes, it's across the street from the Prada store. And I thought it was a kind of fitting image for this process of unearthing forgotten or maybe even repressed history. And kind of as a note on my own sources, I was, and on the background of coming to this, there's a long story and a short story, and I'll try to limit myself to the short story, and if you want the long story, you can ask me. But I'm very much a child of the Cold War. I graduated from college in 1990 and grew up as, I think a lot of people of my generation, quite fascinated by the Soviet Union, and it was sort of forbidden and intriguing. And later, as I started studying the American left, I found that the Soviet Union is this kind of elephant in the room in the history of the American left. And to the extent that anything has been written about the appeal of the Soviet Union to not just communists or radicals, but really liberals and progressives of all kind, there was almost nothing on the particular appeal of the Soviet Union to women. So that was kind of what I started getting into. So, and one other thing I should say, one of my children, both of them are here, asked if I was going to say anything about them, so now I will. And to give you an idea of how long this book took me to write, I realized I was pregnant with the one sitting on the left after my first research trip. So that's a long time. Okay, so I'm going to start with the beginning of the, just from the introduction, and this is where the title comes from this article. By spring 1932, the American girls in Red Russia had begun to attract notice. This is basically quoting from this article. Armed with lipstick and toothbrush and with an insatiable lust for the bizarre and exciting, American girls have been invading Moscow. 200 strong and more, chic, smart young women have come barging into the Red Capital, some lending the boys and girls a hand in building socialism, others seeking husbands among the lonely American engineers or romantic young Russians, always ready to pay homage to the glamorous American girl. Stenographers, nurses, dancers, painters, teachers, sculptors, and writers, serious maidens, determined to take part in the new life that is growing so swiftly. Pauline Emmett, a tall, robust lass from Illinois, fled the social whirl and chose instead the Soviet frontier, where she edits a magazine for American workers and swings a pick and shovel when she's called for social work. Faye Gillis, Brooklyn aviatrix, is hoping to fly for the Soviets. Genia Marling, barefoot dancer and raw vegetable fattist from Los Angeles, marched into Moscow to help organize an international theater. These pert, slim-hip girls, pictured here, fresh-faced and eager, wearing bright American clothes, are a delight to the eye tired of the shapeless drab of Soviet garments. So this breezy description is adapted slightly from a syndicated 1932 news article by Millie Bennett, a divorced journalist from San Francisco and one among the legions of American women drawn to the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. She'd arrived less than 2 years earlier to accept a staff position on the Moscow News, the Soviet Union's first English language newspaper, which journalist Louise started in 1930. Bennett and the women she describes were part of a now forgotten trend. We don't usually think of Moscow as a popular destination for American women in the early 20th century. A mythology surrounds the lost generation of Americans who sought out Paris in the 1920s, And I should say, actually, many, Grant said that people chose Moscow instead of Paris. You have actually many of the same people coming to Paris and then going to Moscow. And the way I think about it is that people were going to Paris to kind of escape something, but people were going to Moscow to sort of take part in building something new in their minds. So people know about that, but few know about the exodus of thousands of Americans, former Paris expats among them, to the Red Jerusalem not long after that. Even fewer are aware of Red Russia's particular appeal for American girls, or more accurately, independent, educated, and adventurous new women. For a significant number of Americans and Westerners more generally, who rightfully questioned the human costs of a social system structured around industrial capitalism, the mere existence of a society that was dedicated ostensibly to the public good rather than individual profit was a source of tremendous hope. Well past the end of the Cold War, it has remained difficult to come to terms with what in the 1920s and 1930s amounted to nearly ubiquitous attention to the Soviet Union among reformers, intellectuals, and members of the artistic avant-garde. We've forgotten both the daring spirit of the new woman and the widespread interest in the Soviet experiment. So some background, the new woman is this figure that appears in US cities and throughout Western Europe. And I say that both the new woman and what came to be called the new Russia come to embody the kind of promise and perils of modernity. This chapter in American women's history highlights themes basic to the development of Western feminist thought. Ideas about citizenship, motherhood, love, work, creative expression, child rearing, sex, and friendship, and also about class, justice, and the ideal society. American women who felt drawn to Russia wanted to witness or feel part of the most dramatic set of events on the world stage. They also hoped for a new era of female possibility, in which women would be not merely politically empowered and economically independent, but also equal partners in love and equal builders of a new world, a classless society where culture, education, and social welfare counted for more than profit. Again, this is the ideal. The story of American new women and the new Russia has been as much repressed as forgotten. As the horrors of Stalinism became undeniable, both the romance of revolutionary Russia itself and the utopian imagination driving that romance were cast as naive, irrational, embarrassing, even dangerous. In Assignment in Utopia, journalist Eugene Lyons described a range of witless female pilgrims who were easy targets for Soviet propaganda. Quoting, "Virginal school teachers and sex-starved wives came close to the masses, especially the male classes, and some of them were so impressed with the potency of Bolshevik ideas that they extended their visas again and again. A few of them emerged to write shrill books about the Soviet Union's new unshackled attitudes, the equality of the sexes, abortion clinics. For Lyons, descriptions of Western women in Moscow functioned primarily as a vehicle for dismissing everyone caught up in the romance of Red Russia. During and even before the Cold War, repentant communist reports cast a dark shadow over what Vivian Gornick has called the romance of American communism, especially as that romance was tangled up in the Soviet Union. By the late 1940s, most Americans saw the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and those who once expressed enthusiasm for the Soviet experiment either recanted or kept quiet about it. By the logic of the Cold War that came after, such enthusiasm reflected badly on suffragists, reformers, journalists, and creative workers who some might otherwise wish to hold up as models. And I suggest this is one reason why historians hadn't tackled this. But this narrative of disenchantment clouds our ability to understand the enchantment itself, the real depth of interest, hope, and fascination that the Soviet Union represented for many people, even when those feelings were mixed with a sense of the gap between realities and ideals. So I say that this is, clearly not a usable past for feminists or even for the left in general, but I argue that like any good love story, the heartbreak and disappointments are just as gripping as the romance, and are perhaps even more instructive. The aspiration and foibles of idealists from an earlier generation tell us something about what continue to be women's most pressing concerns. So there's sort of three main, I guess four main parts to this, but just to, as a kind of background, in general, the what was sometimes called the new Soviet woman pointed toward a different model of female existence. On the left is communist propaganda, I don't know what else to call it, published by the Communist Party, and you can see where the United States is having Miss America. Miss USSR is a shock worker who's super productive on her factory job. But even in liberal periodicals, the right is Women's Home Companion for 1943, showing women in all these different jobs. In terms of those general attractions, not only did Russia, right after the February Revolution, give women the vote, before women in the United States had it, but shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, women were granted access to free abortion, divorce laws became easier, women gained property rights, pretty generous maternity benefits, and there were nurseries, laundries, and dining halls built supposedly to free women from what Lenin himself called domestic drudgery. This wasn't as much due to feminism as it was due to a desire to make every member of Soviet society productive workers and make that possible. And it was easier to be attracted to Russia, or Soviet Union, if you didn't have to live there. So I need to make that clear. So, the other thing that became clear to me is that the attraction, so this is the earlier part of the book, the attraction to revolutionary Russia predated the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and goes back certainly to the 1870s or maybe even earlier. And there were several different revolutionary groups in Russia, but in almost all of them, women were quite visible in the movements, and most of the men in these movements assumed female equality would be part of any kind of a revolution. And these women became legendary in the United States for the role they took in violent acts, because it was said that they were so tender and so sensitive that they were aghast at the Tsar's injustices, the injustice of the regime, and they saw no other possibility than to resort to violence. So there's Maria Spiridonova, but there were many of them. And particularly the waves of Russian Jewish immigrants to the United States at the time of pogroms around the turn of the century helped popularize ideas about these revolutionaries. Many of the people who came to the U.S. were involved in revolutionary movements and interested in ideas like being promulgated by Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done, which is a book about revolution, but it's in the heart of the story, it's about female emancipation. The person who probably did the most to popularize the kind of revolutionary cause in the U.S. was Ekaterina Breshko-Breshkovskaya, who in the U.S. was called Catherine Breshkovsky, or simply Babushka, and she was also known as the little grandmother of the Russian Revolution. Many of the revolutionaries were sort of young and beautiful, but she was a safer, more grandmotherly type, and so she was seen as a fitting representative of the socialist revolutionaries, one of the groups that did practice terrorism. Terrorism was not associated in Russia with killing innocents per se, as we understand it now, but with killing leaders of the people who were associated with doing repressive or violent things, although it certainly did get out of hand. But so Catherine Breshkovsky was actually brought to the U.S. Through two non-English speaking socialist revolutionaries who got in touch with Emma Goldman, who was an immigrant from Russia herself, an anarchist, but she had joined the socialist revolutionaries, and she she was already known as a rabble-rouser, so she took on a pen name or a pseudonym of E.G. Smith. It's like hair and scalp specialist, and she convinced the Society for the Friends of Russian Freedom, which was a quite upstanding organization that was founded by people like Mark Twain and William Dean Howells and the children of several abolitionists in the 1890s, including Alice Stone Blackwell, who was the daughter of Henry Blackwell, the abolitionist, and Lucy Stone, the feminist. And she was an important suffragist. Anyway, so in Goldman's autobiography, she talked about sitting in this sort of fancy New York apartment secretly being the notorious Emma Goldman and convincing them to bring Babushka to the United States. And she toured all over the United States in 1904 to 1905, and she must have met thousands of people. She had so many letters, and everybody loved her and was, drawn to her. And there were poems published in her honor, and it's like everybody who was anybody met her. And she left because the revolution had started. This is a picture from Westover School, which happens to be in the town of Middlebury, right near where I grew up. The girls of Westover School, a private girls' school in Connecticut, adopted the little grandmother. After she went back to Russia, she was exiled to Siberia for like the umpteenth time. And so these girls paid her a monthly salary and kept up her subscriptions to the American magazines she read or whatever. And then when she came back after the revolution, this is her greeting the girls who were her people. So, and after the very first revolution, you see, so again, for those of you not so familiar with Russian history, there were two revolutions. There was the Tsar was overthrown in February of 1917, and then in October, the Bolsheviks took power. The February Revolution was very popular in the United States. The Tsar himself was not very popular. Bolshevik Revolution was much more controversial. So these are after the first revolution, and the suffragist struggle is happening in the United States at this very same time, is heating up. And so I'm struck by, this is reiterating some rhetoric that we're hearing again, this America first, and she's saying no, Russia first in granting suffrage. And this is fashion hints from darkest Russia. This is Mrs. Russia. And she's got equal suffrage, and Mrs. Uncle Sam is saying to Mr. Uncle Sam, and to think you let her get it first. So the suffragists were using this rhetorically in actually a lot of their actions, but in fact, they were really interested in what was happening in Russia. And if you read feminist magazines from the time, there's a whole lot of writing about goings on in Russia. A famine strikes Russia in 1921, and it's particularly bad for a series of reasons that I could go into, but take a long time. And this chapter I call child savers and child saviors, so that you have this kind of dual image of children in Soviet Russia. On the one hand, the famine is devastating, and one of the ways that sympathy is brought to Russia, this new revolutionary regime, is through the suffering children. George Bernard Shaw famously said, "I have no enemies under 7." In terms of who the children are the same to us the world over. Nobody wants to see children suffering and dying. And in fact, there was an organization that was made up of almost entirely of former National Women's Party suffragists who started this American Women's Emergency Committee to try to bring milk and medicine to the children of Russia. The secretary of the treasurer of that organization went and volunteered with the American Friends Service Committee. This is the British wing of it. Both the American and British Quakers started service organizations as an alternative to serving in World War I, because Quakers are pacifists. And the Quakers did not have any kind of a political litmus test for who could volunteer with their service organizations. As the famine got worse and worse, the American Relief Administration took over, that was under Herbert Hoover, took over famine relief operations, and they did not allow women to volunteer on the ground in Russia, but they made an exception for the American Friends Service Committee because they already had women there volunteering in Russia. So this is a report actually written by somebody from the British Friends in 1920. But what I wanted to, is this my laser? What I wanted to point to is, on the one hand, it's describing the terrible conditions that kids are suffering in Russia, but it's also emphasizing that the Russians are doing everything they can for these children, and they have, you know, whenever there's milk, it's gone to children, and they have games, and they have amazing education, and yada, yada, yada. So that you had, on the one hand, this suffering, starving child who is pitied and becomes this rationale for respectable women to be able to go into this revolutionary land. And then there's the possibility that this sick child could be redeemed and become the new Soviet person. And there's so much material that's showing these kind of rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed, engaged, happy, children. So this is one of the early communities that you have of Americans who are volunteering with either the British Friends War Victims Committee or the American Friends Service Committee. Anna Louise Strong, who is this person on the left and becomes, can't see her very well, she becomes important and kind of a sad and tragic figure in the book. She was desperate to get into revolutionary Russia, and she was told by Lincoln Steffens, who's famous for the line when he came back from Russia, "I have seen the future and it works." And he convinced her to go to Russia and to volunteer with the Quakers. She asked to go to Russia. They said, "You can go to Poland." She said, "Could I go to Russia if they need me?" And they said, "No, you can go to Poland." "But could I go?" "No, you can go to Poland." And nonetheless, she slipped off to Russia at the first chance that she could get, kind of defying the Quakers. And right after she got there, within a few weeks, she got typhus and nearly died and depleted a lot of resources. So the Quakers were pretty pissed off at her. And then she came back almost immediately and kind of became the sort of one of the main voices for spreading the word about the possibility of the revolution and the possibilities it could be. And she talked about in her autobiography it's called I Change World, about wanting to be a creator in chaos. So the first real opportunity to participate in this new society, she was offered the opportunity of becoming the chef or chief of the John Reed colony. There were many children orphaned by the famine and war and revolution. This was a colony for kids who were too old for children's homes, but too young to be on their own. And being chef really meant she had the opportunity to raise money for them. And she raised lots of money for them, and then found out that they were siphoning most of the money that she was raising. And it was not actually going to the children. It was going to various petty bureaucrats. And this is just the beginning of several repeated frustrations that Strong has. And she's a character who I'm going to come back to. The next two chapters really focus on people who came to stay for extended periods. The book really began with Ruth Epperson Kennel, who was a writer for children, if you wonder what the connection is between my first book and my second one. And I was looking in her archives, happened to mention this to someone, and someone said, "Have you read Theodore Dreiser's sketch of her in his Gallery of Women?" And I hadn't. And I read it, and it talked about her time in this, basically an American utopian colony in Siberia called Kuzbis. And she was this librarian from Oklahoma, and she and her husband, Frank, decided to volunteer. It's 1922, and they left their 18-month son at home with Frank's mother. and they went to this colony. They had read a story in The Liberator by Mike Gold, Wanted Pioneers for Siberia. And so this colony was formed by some industrial workers of the world, or wobblies, and communists. And it was known for, you can see this kind of pie in the sky sort of rhetoric, and they always called them the pioneers, and we have the kind of Walt Whitman reference. The Cusbus Bulletin is pretty fascinating to read just for the kind of hopeful rhetoric that it engages in. And they particularly emphasize the work of men and the need for strong, pioneer workers. And women are pretty much an afterthought. They said that the kind of call for volunteers said that there would be an excess of Siberian beauties to be found in the environs, so the male workers really didn't need anything else. But they said they could benefit from strong, healthy women who are accustomed to outdoor life, pioneer women whose presence would maintain the proper home life and atmosphere. Allowances were made for men who wanted to bring their wives. However, a number of women, including Kennel, and there was a doctor and a nurse, and a number of a teacher, a number of women came not as wives, but as workers. And in this chapter, even though it was an industrial colony, what I became interested in is how did this colony become a space for women like Kennel to reimagine the terms of domesticity, and what would it mean to live cooperatively. And she wrote a series of articles in The Nation. She called their colony a new Pennsylvania. She said it's not a new Atlantis, it's a new Pennsylvania. It's very practical and hearkening back to these American traditions. There were actually something like 35 industrial or agricultural communes that were started in the Soviet Russia between, I think, 1921 and 1926. And I think 24 of them were majority Americans in them. And this was really one of the only ways to get into Russia before get into Soviet Russia before the mid-1920s, was to sign up with the Society for Technical Aid to Soviet Russia and join one of these communes. Cusbus was the most famous of these, partly because of this lofty rhetoric and partly because there was a lot of controversy around it. There was a big division between the wobblies and the communists when the Soviet Union shifted to its new economic policy, where they brought in elements of capitalism. The pie in the sky idealistic wobblies got really angry. There was one of the, who they called him the comedian of the group, said, "Workers of the world unite," and then be divided into 17 categories, because they developed this wage system and they started having, money, and, so people were unhappy about it. But many of them stayed, and they developed this, community. There's pictures of them having picnics and going on walks in the woods and swimming in the river. And I was struck particularly by this image, which was not high enough quality to return in the book, to keep in the book. It says, "After all the tales of woe, there are still smiles in Kemerovo." That was the main city there. And a group of disaffected colonists had left after the split, and there was one couple that was especially telling stories of the wife was saying how these bewhiskered Slavs were trying to push free love on all the women there, and this, that, and the other thing. There were lawsuits trying to sue the organizers for misleading them. The reason that Kennel is so happy, though, because her husband, they both had been with the Wobblies, but Frank decided that he wanted to go back when a lot of the Wobblies left, and she said, "No, I want to keep my contract." And the reason she really wanted to stay is that she had fallen in love with somebody else. So she is smiling because her husband has gone, and she is now free to pursue her romance. And this is a kind of theme running throughout the book, is all of these women kind of finding this sexual liberation or sexual awakening alongside their political awakening in quite striking ways. Again, you don't really think about, Moscow or Siberia as places of like, but it was, and there were quite a few stories of these women challenging kind of bourgeois morality in the wilds there. Kennel she actually moved to Moscow after she left this colony, and she became a librarian in the Comintern, and then she became Theodore Dreiser's private tour guide on his Russian tour, so that's why he wound up writing about her and his lover. And she went back to the US, but she came back again in 1932 and got a job working on this newspaper that I'd mentioned earlier, the Moscow News, which was the first English language newspaper in Russia, and it was started by Anna Louise Strong, so another venture in which she hopes things will go well and they don't go so well. But you can see this rhetoric of equality and actuality of women, and this was intended to be a newspaper that would be independent. We know there was no such thing as independent journalism in communist Russia, but she thought it would be, not anti-Soviet, but independent. And she had all kinds of problems, not surprisingly, in trying to get it to be this kind of witty, newsy paper for foreigners. She recruited a number of her friends, including Millie Bennett, the one who I opened with, and that's her there. I became quite fascinated with Millie Bennett because of her kind of breezy way of writing, and she also had this kind of hard-boiled sensibility. In the chapter on the Moscow News, I became interested in this distinction between what people wrote publicly and what they really thought, as though I could get to that. But I throughout the book, I used letters, diaries, intimate sources to try to get at the gap between what people would publicly say and privately say. And so I found the personal papers of several women who had worked on the Moscow News. Strong recruited Bennett in about 1930. One of the things that was sort of disheartening was Strong would sort of feel uncomfortable and feel like nobody liked her, and then all her friends would say, "God, what a pain in the neck she is. I can't stand her." So in fact, nobody could stand her. This is when Bennett, I'll read about a paragraph here. Because apartments were scarce, Bennett stayed with Strong. Only after a few weeks did Bennett fully comprehend the conflicts that had riven the paper, the Moscow News. Before this point, she knew only that Strong was driving her crazy. Quote, "There are parts of life that it's just as well not to live, and one of them is being forced to live in 2 rooms with a 46-year-old wench who has driven herself frantic with zeal for Soviet Russia." She has an unpublished novel where she describes Sophia Amanda Britton, who's clearly Strong, as a huge woman, a woman who dominated any scene she marched upon, as does the elephant at the circus, the bull, the arena. A lively, unfading kind of pink and white, blue-eyed American prettiness imprinted on her bigness, and even a deceptive kind of gentleness. When she opened her mouth, the illusion was smashed. Egocentric as a man, insensitive, high-powered, a screaming, fierce cyclone of a female who carried all before her by the very force of her tonnage. She had an enormous capacity for work and used up everybody she could lay hands on while using herself. In fact, that's a really unfair depiction of Strong, who did a great deal to help Bennett and also helped Kennel, who came to work on the paper, a number of people. Bennett wound up marrying a young Russian actor who turned out to have had a homosexual past. Even though they had very liberal laws about sexuality in the 1920s. In 1933, sodomy is made illegal, and her husband is sent off to a prison camp where he leads an agitprop theater troupe in the prison camp. It was an odd story, and Strong made these appeals saying, if he has a homosexual past, why are you locking him up with 1,000 other men? It's not going to be the best way to cure him of this. So lots of interesting speculations in that chapter. The third section is about performance and focuses primarily on two dancers. One is Isadora Duncan, who had an enormous impact primarily before the Russian Revolution. She came in 1905, 1908, 1913, and she was a major figure and really kind of was seen as this embodying the ideals of the Silver Age. But in 1921, she decided that she wanted to come. She said she was sick of bourgeois art. She wanted to see if there was one place in the world that valued its children more than commercialism. And she volunteered to come to Russia to start a school. And so I got interested in thinking broadly about performance, not just performance on the stage, but what does it mean to try to embody an identity? And Russian historians have written about this notion of Stalinist subjectivity. For a long time, it was believed that people who lived in the Soviet Union couldn't possibly believe in all that stuff. But they started looking at diaries of Soviet citizens and found that people really wanted to be the kind of people, or were working hard to be the kind of people that Soviet propaganda said they were. And I got interested in what does it mean for somebody from the outside to want to embody this collective person. So I was looking both at performance in terms of on the stage, but also everyday life performances. And Duncan had a very important impact. Many other dancers followed her, and dance was unique in terms of the American performers in relation to Soviet art. Soviet Union is famous for its dance, or Russia, but primarily ballet. Other forms, Soviet theater, Soviet film, graphic arts, people were interested in learning from what the Soviets were doing. But when it came to ballet, people like Duncan said, ballet is this old bourgeois art form. We're going to show the Soviets how to dance revolutionary dances. So she did start her dance school, and she had another kind of tragic experience, but I kind of pair her with Pauline Kohner, who's on the cover of the book. So Duncan really went to Soviet Russia at the twilight of her career, and she was adored much more in the early period than she was in the later period. She had a kind of tragic love affair with the Russian poet Sergei Yesenin, who was 19 years younger than her. And she used to tell the story of having come, she seems to have sort of made up the story, but she said she was there for a funeral following Bloody Sunday. And she saw a funeral cortege, and this is what moved her to care for the masses. Kohner arrives as a much younger woman, so Duncan was in her 40s when she came, and a lot of the critics talk about her being overweight and kind of past her prime. Kohner comes when she's 22, very much at the beginning of her career, and really has a fabulous experience in the Soviet Union. But she also comes at the time of a funeral, and this is the funeral of Sergei Kirov. And any of you who know any Soviet history, this is kind of the beginning of the Great Terror. So it's kind of a weird time to be coming. And Kohner also has an affair with a famous Russian. She has an affair with Vsevolod Pudovkin. She says, "At last I know what physical love really is." She has another one of these women. And you can see her dances really embodying this sense of tremendous freedom that she has, and the students that she taught. She gets a job at the Gaff Institute of Physical Culture. As Stalinism is cracking down, most of the dance schools are closed, except Duncan's school stays open. Duncan herself is dead by this time. But physical culture, which is sort of like eurythmics or gymnastics, becomes one of the only ways to practice what we might call modern dance. And she has this very idealistic image of the young Soviet youth. But one thing that I found in researching this, something she talked positively later in life about her experiences in the Soviet Union. but failed to make clear the ways in which her successes really depended on being kind of caught up in the Stalinist project. She choreographed a 70,000 person physical culture parade, and it was a great career opportunity for her, but Stalin was in the audience, and with my limited Russian skills, I was able to translate. It was very much a militaristic spectacle that reflected less, I think, her own deep belief than her way of, this is what it takes to succeed here. So it was a somewhat tragic thing. So getting closer to the end, this is, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the particular appeal of Soviet society. Throughout, I should say that many of these figures are Jewish, but there's, not these figures, the figures that I was talking about earlier, but there's a particular appeal, and I can say more in the Q&A, going back again before the revolution of Soviet Russia to African Americans. After the revolution, African Americans become especially prized in the struggle, and the American Communist Party takes up civil rights very early because of instructions from Moscow. This is the crew from what I call the most famous film never made, although you've probably never heard of it, but Langston Hughes and Dorothy West and a number of other Harlem Renaissance figures went to the Soviet Union in 1932 as guests of the government to make a film about American race relations. It was going to be the first true portrait of American race relations. They said it could never be made in the United States. And it turns out it couldn't be made in the Soviet Union either. It was right before United States was going to recognize the Soviet Union. And they said if this film is made, they won't recognize them. So they didn't make it. But most of the people who came actually wound up having quite a wonderful time. Other people have written about this film, but I thought nobody had really talked about it in terms of performance. So these people, most of them stayed for, some stayed for the rest of their lives. There's a film that's being made right now called Black Russians. There are a number of people who are children, grandchildren of some that came with this group. There was also an agricultural colony. And so on the one hand, there was this sense that there was no racism in the Soviet Union. And so people like the actress Frances E. Williams, who could not go to acting school in the United States because she was black, was able to study with Meyerhold and Natalia Satz and really launched a career. She became an important television actress. And there's also a pretty long tradition going back to before the revolution of having a real interest in black performers in Russia. But then there was the fact that, as I say, the people who came to make the film, they felt like they were kind of almost treated like movie stars. They were treated so well, but they were also kind of public spectacles. And they would say, well, it's just friendly curiosity, but there was a complicated relationship to race in the Soviet Union, just as there was a complicated relationship to jazz, which is ultimately banned. The Chocolate Kitties is interesting because it traveled, I believe, through France. Several other African-American dance and singing groups traveled. Josephine Baker, who became well-known in Paris, of course, was originally in this group, but she didn't tour with them to Russia. Vertov's 1/6 of the World has scenes from this film illustrating sort of the decadence of American jazz. So there was this real interest and fascination, but it was also associated with decadence. And then the traditions of depicting Africans and African Americans were very problematic in some ways. I don't even have to tell you very much about this play for you to see that it's problematic. These are all people in blackface, and the boy and the monkey are friends, and they're separated and they're reunited in Russia where there's no racism. So this is another Frances E. Williams, who was a articulate, educated figure in the Communist Party. I said Frances William. Williana Burroughs. And this this image was shown on the cover without identifying her or anything on the cover of a Russian workers' newspaper, making her seem like a sort of member of the black proletariat when she's not really. The other thing that I was going to say, though, is part of the reason that the African Americans had such a positive experience in the Soviet Union is that they were invited as guests of the government to tour Soviet Central Asia, and they got really interested in the treatment of Soviet national minorities, and particularly women, and repeated stories in the writings of Langston Hughes and Louise Thompson Patterson. She was the organizer of the group, of women who had been veiled, often had been forced to marry at young ages, and now they were, bobbed their hair, unveiled, vice president. Again, it's a more complicated story. There were, in fact, women who were forced at gunpoint to unveil, so it's not necessarily liberating, but African Americans seeing national minorities dealt with in what they saw as a much more positive way was extremely appealing to them. And I should also mention that their visit was right at the same time as the Scottsboro case, which was an important case in the United States involving false accusations of rape and strong racist feelings in the U.S. So I kind of end or lead toward the end with World War II and the Great Terror that preceded it. And I focus on two women who are, I would say, as famous for being, I don't know if mocked is the right word, but criticized by other people as they are famous for their work. And those are Margaret Bourke-White, the photographer, who was the only American photographer in Russia at the time that the Germans bombed Soviet Union, and Lillian Hellman, who made a film, The North Star, that was famous partly for her frustration with the process of it, but it helped lead to her being blacklisted. And part of the reason that that people like Hellman and Bourke-White were criticized is because of their association with Stalinism, which becomes especially problematic after all the revelations of the Great Terror, which they arguably denied. But World War II was this interesting moment because you have the government, the U.S. government, actually funding propaganda films like this one, Song of Russia, which was partly ghostwritten by Anna Louise Strong, and she talked about how the heroine should refuse to go back to an easy life in the United States. She wants to stay and help Russia. And so this kind of ambivalent legacy. And I end with an epilogue that tries to come to grips, at least to some degree, with legacies and really the question of spying. I open with a discussion of Josephine Herbst, who's accused in a book by, what's his name? Koch, I'm forgetting. Stephen Koch, Double Lives, and he kind of implicates her in spying. And I talk about the contrast between her portrait of her experiences in the left and his, and she comes off as two different people in those portraits. And also this, did I have to deal with spying? And it's the only part of the book that I write in a first person. In a book like this one, could I really avoid the issue of espionage? My concern with the attraction that Russian revolutionary ideology held for American new women did not necessarily lead me to Spies, but it did from the beginning raise the question of loyalty. Loyalty to one's country, a set of ideas, one's own experience, one's sense of justice, a party, a lover, a community. For whom or for what should one sacrifice, believe, trust? All of these things, and fear that critics would accuse me of hiding or denying something if I didn't go there, finally made me start actively looking for spies. If nothing else, I wanted to be able to explain why the people I was looking at were different from those murky, dangerous figures beyond the pale of history. In fact, in my effort to identify spies, I discovered many more shades of gray than a Cold War-inflected discourse, which places spies somewhere near pedophiles on the spectrum of social acceptability, admits. The more I started looking, the more I found that was arguably suspicious, but the more I started even wondering, what does that mean to be a spy? And then I come back to this question of Stalinist. That term Stalinist has been applied to anyone on the left who did not publicly condemn the Soviet Union. If revelations from Soviet archives and decoded Venona cables have been hailed as cause to rethink historians' denunciations of McCarthyism, I'm wondering what can be said about and from our current moment as we look through the lens of those no longer new revelations to and through the lens of women in the 1960s and 1970s. And this is a moment in which Lillian Hellman, Josephine Herbst, and other women started writing memoirs about their experience. In 1978, Lillian Hellman admitted that she was indeed late to believe the political intellectual persecutions under Stalin, but she still insisted that she had been nobody's girl. Her memoirs revisit trips to the Soviet Union with the suggestion that she possessed more critical faculties than she in fact exercised at the time. And so it is for Herbst, who, recalling 30 years later her visit to the Kharkov Writers' Congress, said she was disturbed by the number of outstanding writers who were missing and by the emphasis on ideological correctness over literary quality. In fact, though, if you read her writings from the 1930s, she says nothing about any of this. Even recognizing this, I still find myself moved by her words, she says. But who of our literary generation was not a crime snob of a sort? Who did not lean toward the underdogs, peddlers, thieves, prostitutes, beyond the call of duty, all the underbelly of the world, which looked so fat and smug on top? Perhaps we had gone to Russia because it had been so almost universally despised by the cautious and the respectable. Who of us had not dreamed of freedom, limpid affections, intensity of above all, passionate friendships, and had not become as well demanding, possessive? We wanted the universe, we wanted all. And leaning out from our traveling trains to wave farewell, goodbye, we rounded that long curve back to war again. After the Second World War, after the Cold War, and after everything, what remains of those who have been reluctant to acknowledge the Soviet Union's place in the legacy of the left in general, or left feminism in particular? Both the Soviet Union and communism itself are largely taboo subjects, despite their outsized influence on many individuals, because it seems to me to be even a small c communist was to be disloyal, and if disloyal, a traitor, and if a traitor, a potential spy, and if that, all discussion stops. These days, as we try to distinguish refugees from terrorists and legitimate dissent from security threats, and as women continue to struggle with the same things they struggled with in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, things like balancing a career and motherhood, working to attain equity with men in the political, economic, and domestic spheres, finding a romantic relationship that is truly a partnership of equals. There is much to be learned about desire, faith, human fallibility, and lost possibility from the hopes and failures of yesteryear's new women, women for whom a Russian chapter once seemed as if it might rewrite the entire story. And that's it. Thank you. There was one person, she may still be alive, who I tried to interview, and she wouldn't talk to me. Ruth, I'm forgetting her last name. She wrote a book called I Went to the Soviet Arctic, and she was over 100. And I tried to talk to her, and she didn't want to talk to me. And I'm not surprised that she didn't want to talk to me, because she'd gone on to a very successful career and probably didn't want to acknowledge the very positive ways she'd written about the Soviet Union in 1939, which is really at the height of all the terror. There are descendants of people who are still alive. I spoke with the granddaughter of Williana Burroughs, the African-American woman who I showed the picture of her with her two sons. I spoke with the the daughter of Louise Thompson Patterson, who was one of the organizers of the black and white film crew. And then, like I said, there's this film being made called Black Russians, where they've interviewed people who are actually living in the Soviet Union. And I spoke with the daughter of some dancers, but nobody who actually went there in the 20s and 30s. There was a kind of another wave, particularly of African Americans in the 1960s, but I kind of stop in the 50s, except to the extent that I talk about some of these women who are looking back on the 30s and the 60s. So, and I should say, like I said, a lot of these people, like Josephine Herbst, again, probably more known for her visits to Paris than her visits to Soviet Russia. Some other, Louise Bryant, more known from Reds, more in Beatty's movie, but she also spent time in Paris as well. So there are these, I think, interesting kinds of connections. And if you read Exile's Return, the classic memoir of Paris in the 20s by Malcolm Cowley, in the back of the book, he has a kind of list of like, where's the place to be in certain times, and he sort of makes the case that Paris is the place in, like, say, 1923, but by 1932, Moscow is the place to be. So you do have a lot of people hopping between these different expat communities, searching for something other than what they were finding in the United States. My grandparents went in the 70s, and I remember them bringing back, they brought balalaika and they brought the nesting dolls. And I talk in the acknowledgments, I think, about this kind of obsession that I had with the nesting dolls, and the very last one, trying to pry open the last one that doesn't come open, and that sort of mystery of that. And I think there is this resonance of Soviet Russia, even as it's the sort of ultimate evil, but it's representing this strange kind of possibility still, I think, for people. For me, if there's a lesson, the lesson is that there are not easy answers. I think there was so much hope and possibility, and the destructiveness makes it very hard to see the hope and possibility, and the two have to be held together. They're not really separable, but they're both worth grappling with, I think, which probably doesn't really answer your question. No, yeah, and it was, and even they did try to create dining rooms, and they really did try to create them, but it was never adequate. And they didn't really try to refigure gender roles. They didn't say, if there aren't enough laundries, let's have the men do that just as much as the women. That didn't happen. It was like, let's relieve women from this burden by socializing child care and housekeeping and dining, but they never managed to really do it. And then women who were mostly all working full-time were then all mostly doing all the work in their home. And in fact, a friend who's a Russian historian, when I was first working on this project, she was saying, Russia's like the most sexist country in the world. I can't believe that you would think that this is a site of women's liberation. But many American women thought that it would be, and it could be. And again, coming from the outside, just reading the rhetoric, it looked pretty good. It wasn't so good if you were living there.
No, it's a nightmare.
So, like I was saying, there were, I think, about 35 of American colonies, each of them with a few hundred members. Sorry, not all of them American. I think 24 of them were American. People were coming from all over the world, including France, Germany, particularly Western Europe, but there were people coming from Africa, from India, Japan. This was going to be the last becoming first, and yeah, all the rhetoric. So it was attractive to people all over the world.
So yeah. Is it spread out through Russia? Or?
Yes, most people, Moscow had this great magnetic force, but people were throughout not just Russia, but the whole Soviet Empire. spread out. So more in Russia, but more in Russia too, and more in Moscow. But these colonies are throughout the Soviet Union.
I was at the Kemerovo
You were there?
2 years ago.
Really?
Not as a colony.
Yeah. Yeah, they probably know a lot more about this. So did you know that there had been an American colony there?
I don't know. Because it's the Russian coal industry.
Yes. Oh, and are you in the coal business?
No.
No.
I visited the coal institute.
Yeah, so yeah, it was this strong mining. And I didn't mention actually the something like 40 of several of the colonists who stayed on were then killed in purges in the late 1930s. So this dream, dies pretty hard. Yeah. Yes, and very much like you say, united by English language. So you had American, Australian, New Zealand, British, people kind of united by speaking English. The Moscow News really becomes the center of the American colony until the embassy was founded. There's a great, very silly article co-written by Millie Bennett and Ruth Epperson in American Mercury that's making fun of all these idealistic dreamers this young couple that wants to sit and hold hands on the wake of communism or whatever. But they were part of that too. And you see lots of descriptions of the parties. And I just was teaching this book, Moscow Yankee, which gives we read The Sun Also Rises. We were looking at Americans in France and then Soviet Union, and really some interesting similarities and differences in the character types. But you definitely, especially a lot of journalists are all interacting with each other, and they all meet the same people and sit in the same rooms of the same figures keep coming up. But there's a book called The Moscow Correspondence, which is about all the supposedly about all the news people, and they say, but there were only men. I found dozens, at least a dozen women who were foreign correspondents in Moscow who just had been left out of the story. Well, most of the research, that must have been a softball for me. That's my husband, who's probably trying to be under cover. Most of the research that I did was actually in the United States, but I did attempt to learn Russian for this project, and should know it a lot better than I do, given how long I studied it. But I did spend a total of, I guess, a little over a month in Moscow on 2 separate trips and visited a number of archives. My favorite Moscow archive story was besides the one of the dustbin of history, was being up there in the archive, and one archivist says to the other, "Boy, her Russian is really bad." And I said, "Not that bad." Like, got that one covered. No, it was actually fascinating. One of one thing that I found in the archives that really fascinated me. You think about the Communist Party like trying to recruit people. Anna Louise Strong, I discovered in the archives, was like trying really hard for years to join the Communist Party, and they wouldn't have her. She tried to join in the Soviet Union. They didn't really want her, and there was correspondence between the Soviet Party and the American Party saying, well, we don't really want her. Do you want her? No, we don't really want her. So she was this kind of sorry figure. But yeah, the reason that this book took me so long was that I was interested in these personal sources. So it meant that I was going to archives all over the country. I actually did some research in Paris too, because we were here on another time, and in Amsterdam. A lot of the stuff on Catherine Breshkovsky was from Amsterdam, and I did find myself identifying a lot with people, even as I found them pathetic, or I felt sorry for them, or I started to dislike them. There were still parts of them that I really identified with, particularly the struggles that they were having. And I was a young mother myself. Now I'm not so young. what does it mean to try to balance everything in our lives and to have a career and to have a family and to feel like you're doing something meaningful. We haven't solved it. So. Well, so when John Reed died in 1921, it's still really quite early, so that the colonies per se aren't really starting. I do talk about Louise Bryant, his wife, and she worked closely with the Quakers. The Quaker House actually became another center prior to the Moscow News, was another center of the Anglo-American community. And Bryant talks about the sort of heroic work they're doing, and also celebrates what the Russian children. So I actually just was writing something on the 1919 Red Scare and women in Russia, and was looking more at Bryant stuff than I even did for this book. And there's some of you are familiar with. There's a kind of long-running debate about what happened with John Reed at the end. Emma Goldman, some of you may know, was exiled to Soviet Russia in 1919, and she went from being pro-Soviet to very strongly anti-Soviet, and saw Reed in Moscow, and she said that Reed was starting to have real regrets. And I found some intelligence documents, the surveillance documents of Bryant. Bryant told one of the agents who I guess had interviewed her that Reed was disappointed, but it's not clear whether she told him that to placate him or because he really was. So I don't know that anyone's going to come up with an answer. It's certainly been probed quite a bit. Yeah, I think those dynamics are really quite interesting. If you go look at the Kuzbis colony, there were a number of Russian women, Siberian beauties, who were marrying American colonists. And there were also kind of critical reports of these. The Americans thought they could do everything better than the Russians. They would show the Russians how to really have a revolution, and they were doing everything wrong, and they were inefficient, and da-da-da. So, there's sort of less, there is some interaction, but there's less than you might expect, although many of the people did learn the language. I'm going to have to think about that one if I have a good answer. I saw certainly reviews of some of the performers' work that were not necessarily by women. Most of the critics that I read were men. And then I also have seen portraits of Russian women. Oh, I do have one example, actually, that's really interesting. So Ruth Epperson Kennel, how many people had heard of her before tonight? Nobody, which is what I would assume. But she actually was quite well known in Russia, and she was rediscovered and became this kind of feminist cult heroine in the 70s in Russia. Somebody wrote a book called Zagadka Ernitu, because Ernita was the name that Dreiser gave to her, and she became fascinated. This one Russian journalist became fascinated with who was this woman in Siberia, and wrote a book about Kennel in Russia. So it does suggest that some of these women to a certain degree, at least at a later time, became kind of feminist heroes of a sort, I guess, which doesn't really tell about at the time. But there was, in fact, I think some of their stories are better known in Russia than they are here. One more, Grant says. Or not. We can just stop. Thank you. Thank you all so much.